fire, reading my mother's copy from when she was a child, J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan and Wendy, retold for little people. The story of Peter Pan and Wendy. J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan and Wendy, retold by May Byron for little people, with the approval of the author and pictures by Mabel Lucy Atwell. Shall we begin? Chapter 1. The family at number 14. Once upon a time, there was a little girl about 2 years old. Her name was Wendy, Mora, Angela, Darling, but she was always called Wendy for short. One day she was playing in the garden, and she ran to her mother with some flowers she had picked, and she looked so sweet, just like a little flower herself, that Mrs. Darling said, "Oh, why can't you stay like this forever?" Then Wendy began to see that one didn't stay at 2 for the rest of one's life. Indeed, 2 is the beginning of the end. The end is being grown up. Once you get to 21 or so, you can never be ungrown up again. But Mrs. Darling did not tell this to Wendy. Between 2 and 21, there was lots of time for her to find out. Mrs. Darling was a perfect dear, just the sort of mother one would choose, as sweet as honey, with lovely eyes and a mouth that looked like a kiss. It had got like that with all the kissing her children so often. There were 3 children, Wendy, John, and Michael, and Mrs. Darling didn't know which she loved best. They were all pretty good, but Wendy was the best because she tried to make herself as like her mother as she could be. It wasn't easy, of course, but she still tried. The 3 little darlings had a very nice nursery with lots of toys and picture books, also a night nursery with 3 little beds in it, and they had a most uncommon kind of nurse. She was called Nana, like other nurses, but she was really a large Newfoundland dog. Her kennel was in the nursery so that she could keep her eyes on the children all the time. She was rather prim and particular, and would have everything just so, but she was splendid at games and would join in the wildest romps. In fact, she was a real treasure. She bathed and dressed the children, saw that they got up and went to bed in proper time. Oh, I tell you, she wouldn't stand any nonsense. She gave them their medicine when it was wanted, changed their pinnies when they became too grubby, and took them to the kindergarten and back every day, carrying an umbrella if it looked like rain. The only person at number 14, this was the Darling's house, who did not much care for Nana was Mr. Darling, the father of Wendy, John, and Michael. He was very faddy about what the neighbours thought, and he felt that they must certainly think it extremely odd to have a dog for a nurse. So Nana was never allowed to appear in the drawing room, and if visitors came, she was shut up in the nursery, while the door was opened by the tiny little maidservant, Lisa. Everybody knew that Mr. Darling was not the best of friends with Nana, but everybody pretended not to know. It was a pity. He was so set against her. However, the children had other things to take up their minds. When the kindergarten part of the day was over, and it wasn't time yet for the evening romps and dances, they talked to each other about the Neverland. One could go on doing that for hours. The Neverland was a make-believe island full of delightful places and interesting people. It was very hard to describe because an island of that sort changes about from day to day according to how you want it to be. It might be all over fairies, dwarves and goblins, or it might have giants who live in enchanted castles, and princes, always the youngest of 3, who go and attack them, or it might have a robber's cave and a tumble-down cottage. Where a witch makes magic, there could be pirates there too, and all sorts of ships. That's where an island comes in so useful, and coral reefs and underground rivers. There's no end to the wonderful things in the Neverland. The most wonderful of all, though, is Peter Pan. Now, Mrs. Darling knew more or less about the Neverland. Very likely, when she was little, she had had a make-believe island of her own, crammed full of flowers and kisses and fairy ladies. As time went on, she forgot about it. Still, she liked to hear what the children had to tell her. There was one thing, however, which puzzled her, and that was the name, Peter Pan. Wendy had the most to say about him, but John and Michael mentioned him now and again then. When Mrs. Darling asked, "But who is Peter Pan?" nobody could explain. Only Wendy said that he wasn't a grown-up person. He was just her size. Wendy was now about 9. Mrs. Darling thought perhaps he was some boy at the kindergarten. But one day Wendy told her that Peter sometimes came in the night and sat at the end of her bed, playing on his pipes. No kindergarten boy would do that. Besides, he couldn't get into the house without somebody knowing. So Mrs. Darling said that Wendy was talking nonsense. Nobody could come in at night like that. Wendy replied that it was not nonsense. Peter came in by the window, she said. You know those funny leaves that were on the floor today by the window? You couldn't think what they were. Mrs. Darling certainly had picked up some queer unknown leaves. She said, "What have these leaves got to do with Peter Pan?" "They are off his shoes," said Wendy. "Naughty boy. He will not wipe his shoes. He never does." "Why have you never told me all this before?" asked her mother. "I suppose I forgot," said Wendy. Mrs. Darling was very uneasy, and she searched all over the nursery to see if the naughty boy was hiding anywhere. She asked Mr. Darling if he had ever heard of a person called Peter Pan, but he said, "Oh dear me, it's some silly stuff that Nana has been putting into the children's heads. What do you expect if you have a dog for a nurse?" She thought she would show him the leaves, but on second thoughts, she did not. The following evening, Mrs. Darling was sitting sewing by the night nursery fire. Nana had gone out, so she herself had bathed the little ones and put them to bed. They had dropped off to sleep while she sang to them. She had lit the 3 night lights. Everything was quiet, as could be. Presently it was so peaceful that she went to sleep too. And suddenly the night nursery window flew open of itself, and a lovely boy dropped in. He was dressed in leaves of every colour. Then he saw a grown-up sitting there. He was very much annoyed. Mrs. Darling, waking with a start, knew at once, though I can't say how she knew, that this must be Peter Pan. That's the end of chapter 1. Can't wait to find out what happens in chapter 2. Shall we continue? Chapter 2. How Mr. Darling disliked Nana. Mrs. Darling cried out in her surprise, and that moment the door opened and Nana came in. When she saw the boy, she growled and sprang at him. She did not catch him, for he leapt through the window before she could pull it down, but she caught his shadow and brought it in her mouth to Mrs. Darling. It was quite a common sort of shadow. It might have belonged to any boy. Mrs. Darling rolled it up carefully and put it away in a drawer. She was more puzzled than ever, but she knew if she told Mr. Darling what she had seen, he would say it all came from having a dog for a nurse, and really Nana had done her best. Nothing more happened until about a week later. It was a Friday evening. Mr. and Mrs. Darling were dressing to go out to a party, and Nana was busy putting the children to bed. She began as usual with Michael. She had put him in the bath water, taken the towel in her mouth, and set Michael on her back to carry him. But Michael was cross because he couldn't stay up any longer. He shouted and kicked, and he said he wasn't going to bed. I won't, he cried, and I don't love you any more, Nana. Mrs. Darling looked so very pretty that Michael became good at once. She was all in white, with a necklace that Mr. Darling had given her, and a bracelet that Wendy had lent her. Wendy thought it was lovely to have a bracelet good enough to lend to such a pretty lady. Mrs. Darling was like a smile and a kiss and a flower all made into one. Wendy and John were playing at being father and mother. They had just had a make-believe baby born and were ever so pleased. Michael couldn't play because he was in his bath. It was terribly lonely being soaped and sponged. Oh, you can't think how particular Nana was. Just when the others were so jolly, Michael jumped out of the water, and before he was half dry, he was cuddling up to Mrs. Darling. Some others would have minded hugging a wet child, but Mrs. Darling was so sweet. At this moment the door banged open and slammed shut. Not of itself, of course, but because Mr. Darling rushed in a raving, ramping, roaring rage. Mr. Darling was a kind man, but he had got what you call a short temper. That is, his temper was very good for a short while, and then very bad for a short while, and so on, turn and turn about. This was often rather awkward, because he changed so suddenly. This time the bad temper was come on all in a minute. Mr. Darling had been trying to tie his party tie, and it wouldn't let him fix it. Ties are often like that, especially if they know you're in a hurry. "What is the matter, father dear?" said Mrs. Darling. "Matter?" yelled Mr. Darling, and his eyes nearly started out of his head. "Why, this tie will tie around the bedpost all right enough, but it won't go round my neck. I've done it 20 times over, and it simply refuses to be tied." "Dear, dear," said Mrs. Darling. The children all tried to put on expressions, showing how very sorry they were, but Mr. Darling took no notice. He worked himself up into an even worse rage, and went on to say that they would all be starved now, because he bellowed he wouldn't go to the party unless his tie was tied properly around his neck, and if he didn't go to the party, he should never go to his office again, and then he should never earn any more money, and he and Mrs. Darling and the children would become poor homeless beggars, all on account of the tie. "Let me try, dear," said Mrs. Darling, in a voice like a cooing dove, and she fastened his tie for him quite calmly and easily. The next moment Mr. Darling, in a wonderful good humour, was prancing about the room with Michael on his back. His short bad temper was over until next time. Everybody was dancing and jumping and squeaking with delight, when Nana, who generally joins in romps, hurried in, and she knocked up by accident against Mr. Darling as he whirled to and fro, and a lot of her long hairs came off upon his nice new trousers. This annoyed him dreadfully, and although Mrs. Darling brushed him clean, he began to talk again about how stupid it was to have a dog for a nurse. Mrs. Darling felt sad that he did not get on well with Nana, so she told Mrs. Darling felt sad that he did not get on well with Nana, so she told him about the strange boy who had come in and gone out at the window, and how Nana had tried to seize the boy, but only got hold of his shadow. "Pooh, nonsense," said Mr. Darling, but when he was shown the shadow, he left off saying nonsense. It was not a very odd shadow, but of course being left wrapped up in a drawer had made it queerer. While Mr. Darling was looking at it, Nana returned to give Michael his cough medicine, carrying the bottle and the spoon in her mouth. Michael said at once that he wouldn't take it. He said the same thing every night. Nana waited patiently. "Come, be a man, Michael," said his father. "Won't," replied Michael. This is his pet word. "I will fetch you a chocolate to take after it," said Mrs. Darling, and she left the room. "You shouldn't pamper him," cried Mr. Darling, and he went on. "Michael, when I was a little boy, I took medicine without all this fuss. I said, 'Thank you, dear father and mother, for giving me stuff to make me well, and the medicine I have to take is much, much nastier than yours. I would take it now just to show you, only the bottle is lost.'" "Oh, I know where it is," said Wendy, who was in her nightgown, and in another minute she was back with Mr. Darling's proper dose in a glass. Mr. Darling really hated taking it, and he made all sorts of excuses. He said he should be sick, and there was a lot more in his glass than in Michael's, and so on. Michael said father must take his first, and when Mr. Darling said no, Michael first, Michael said father's a cowdy custard. "Why not both of you take it at the same time?" said Wendy. "All right," said Mr. Darling. Then Wendy counted 3, and Michael swallowed his medicine, but Mr. Darling hid his own glass behind him. He didn't know what to do with the stuff, and he couldn't be made to drink it, so he poured it into Nana's bowl. He pretended this was great fun. The children watched him in silence. When Nana came in again, he told her, "Good dog, Nana, I have put some milk in your bowl." And indeed it looked like milk. But when Nana tasted it, she knew he had played a trick on her. She went into her kennel, shedding tears, and had to be cuddled and comforted so directly after had the 3 children, for Mr. Darling, who knew he was in the wrong, made things worse by being very cross with Nana. "I won't have a dog in the nursery," he shouted. "I shall tie her up in the backyard," and he did so. Just fancy tying up your nurse in the yard. Poor Nana could not think why he should treat her like that. She whined, for it was snowing off and by she barked, for she could smell some sort of danger in the air. Mrs. Darling heard these noises while she put the children to bed and lit their night lights. Wendy, John, and Michael fell asleep while she was still singing to them. She felt uneasy at leaving them alone, but there did not seem any harm likely to happen. Besides, the party where she was going was only a few doors off number 27. Still, she would have been glad to stay at home by the 3 little heads in the 3 little beds. She looked out at the stars. There seemed a great many more than was usual, and much nearer too, as if they wanted to peep inside the house. Then she went off with Mr. Darling. Neither of them felt the least bit partyish. They crossed the road to number 27, and directly these grown-up people were well out of the way, the stars became wildly excited and could be heard, if anybody had but listened, calling out, "Hi, Peter! Hurry up! Come along, Peter!" That's the end of chapter 2. I'll be continuing the story next time.